Hello everyone, and this is BioPhoenix here, and we're back again with yet another random-ass anime review. So the next one we're taking a look at is Mask of Zeguy, and it happens to be a 2-episode OVA that is considered action, adventure, and I guess nowadays it would probably be called an ikezai or some shit. Because it's one of those series, it's about going to another world, and, you know, this is way before it was done to death. So anyways, let's get talking about the story itself. So it stars our main character, Mickey, who happens to be a high school student, of course, and her and her best friend Sayaka were having an argument on the way home from school, and for some reason, the bus ends up backing up on its own, and then the bus kind of goes into this weird tunnel thing, and then somehow, they're in the other world, being the cloud world. So when Miki wakes up, she sees that her best friend Sayaka is being kidnapped by a bunch of monsters that are being controlled by Himiko. And the Himiko in this series is a reference to the historical figure, the one that was the ruler of Wa. In fact, a lot of characters within this show are actually historical figures. Like the other two supporting main characters being Hijikata Toshizo, who was a part of the Shinsengumi, and then there's Hiraga Genai, who was a part of the Edo period. So these two characters were trying to stop Himiko from getting the Mask of Zeguy, because if she got that mask, you can probably take a guess what would happen. But yeah, the world would be in danger. So yeah, these two characters end up meeting up with Mickey, and of course they find out that she actually reacts to a certain artifact that they have, and they all ride along in this giant machine, which is actually not a machine, it's actually a living, breathing creature that just happens to look like one. It's kinda interesting. So that's pretty much the basics of it. They just have to fly around, try to stop Himiko from getting complete power, while also trying to save her friend Sayaka, who is being sacrificed for it. But before moving on, one character I do want to mention real quick that I thought was pretty amusing was Leonardo da Vinci is in this anime, and they actually made him a bad guy. So while this does seem like a pretty typical ikezai anime, so to speak, I do think it does have some pretty interesting ideas, like the whole fact that it has a bunch of random historical figures, and like some of them are good guys and some of them are bad and they fight each other. I think that's kind of cool. It kind of reminds me of the Fate series, but just without the whole survival death game show type aspect to it. And some other interesting things that I have to mention that I haven't mentioned already is that there's a town in this show where everyone speaks through their mind, so like telepathy sort of, which is kind of neat. And then there's a lot of different, like, cyborg enemies that try to hunt down the main cast, so you kind of have some samurais going up against some cyborgs, like, that's kind of rad. So now, let's get moving on to the other things, like the animation. And the animation here was really good, no joke. Like, I actually thought it was really good for what it was, and also it's, like, miles better than the last show I was watching. Makes a mockery out of that one. So the character and monster designs in this one are really cool looking. I really do like all the characters' outfits and designs. Even though the main character is, yeah, your typical high school uniform, but I feel like they did make some pretty decent details and aesthetics to it to at least make it look a little bit more interesting. And there's one villain character in this show who almost looks like something out of Avatar: The Last Airbender. To be exact, he looks like someone from the Fire Nation. So I thought that was both cool and amusing at the same time, but it's still a pretty sick design. And all the backgrounds in this show are pretty nice looking too. Nothing, like, really amazing, but they are nice to look at and are not boring as shit. So the show definitely has a nice art style that I do really like, but as for the animation flow itself, I think it's pretty solid. Like, it does have some nice animation flow going on with the action scenes and, like, just random other scenes in general. Like, there's really not a lot of, like, janky animation here. Even though it is hand-drawn, I know there are some people out there that think that whenever a show is newer, that means that the animation is automatically better, which is not true at all. But yeah, I do think the show is pretty nicely animated in many scenes and doesn't look super janky or anything. In fact, the last anime that I reviewed, I really wish it had like animation like this for its action scenes. It would have been so much better, but anyways, that's besides the point. But yeah, Mask of Zeguy's animation, I think is actually quite solid and pretty good. And now, as for the show's music, It is good, but I can't say it's super memorable though. Like, I just watched the show and I do remember like parts of the music, but not really. The only background songs that I really remember was there was one song that played during when she was taking a bath and it was kind of jazzy sounding, and then there was two songs that played during some action scenes that were actually pretty rockin' and were probably the best like background music that I remember hearing, but other than that, the rest of it was fine, like not bad at all, but just isn't very memorable. But what does make up for this is that the opening and ending themes I think are actually really good. They're very nice upbeat pop tracks that sound very 80s like, and yeah, even though I know this is made in 93, but I mean, hey, it is going to represent some things of the 80s, and you know what? I have no problems with that. I think they're actually really great songs. Definitely a lot better than the opening and ending theme from the last one I looked at. Alright, now, as for the voice acting in this one, if you're gonna watch it in English, unfortunately, it's not really good. Though, it does have some parts about it that are pretty amusing, but for the most part, I can't really write it off and call it good, because there's just too many issues. So I'll get my two decent, nice things I'll say about it, is that Mickey was voiced by Lisa Ortiz, and Hijikata was voiced by Dan Green. And you know what? I actually think both of these roles were actually done okay. Not great, but you know what? For some of their most earliest works, they're honestly not that bad. In fact, I think this might have actually been one of Dan Green's first roles he ever did, next to either Outlanders or Giant Robo the animation. It was around that era, so you know what? I actually think he did okay for what he had to work with. But that's the nicest thing I can say about this show's dub, is that, yeah, those two were actually done okay. Not the best, but they were alright. But then everyone else is just a complete mess. Like, the voice of Himiko is just terrible. Like, I don't know how to describe it, but it just sounds really, like, phony and forced. Like, I don't know if that makes any sense, but either way, like, once you hear it, like, you're gonna be like, wow, that's bad. And then that one Fire Nation looking dude. When I first heard it, I thought it was Eric Stewart, because it did sound almost like Kaiba, although a really shitty version of Kaiba, so I thought it was him, but no, it was actually some dude named Josh Mosby. So yeah, knowing the fact that I just said that it sounds like a shitty version of Kaiba, yeah, it's definitely not a good voice role, but I'm not gonna lie, there was a few lines that he said that actually did make me laugh out loud, so I can at least say that one was more of the so bad it's good kind. So yeah, overall, yeah, the voice acting is definitely not good. Even, like, the two nicest things I can say about it with, you know, Dan Green and Lisa Ortiz, as interesting as it is, I feel like that's really the only reason why you would even watch this one with the dub. And also with, like I said, there are some parts in it that are kind of so bad it's funny, so it's at least not the boring bad. But if you did want to take it somewhat seriously, then yeah, I would say just go with the Japanese version for this one. So now, as my overall thoughts on Mask of Zeguy, is that this show is pretty average, but I'm not gonna lie and say that I did have some fun with it. Fun enough that I can say it's decent. Not great or amazing, but I at least liked it enough to say that it was decent, which is, I know, pretty generous, but yeah, it is a pretty average show. But you know what? For 2 episodes that are 35 minutes each, I honestly think they did, like, okay for what they had to work with. Also, one really good thing I will say is that it's one of those series that actually does end on, like, a decent note and doesn't end on a cliffhanger or some bullshit. Because I know that kind of thing does kind of annoy me, and especially when the fact that this show doesn't even have a manga base after it or anything. Yeah, this is one of those shows that is just completely original, and honestly, I wish there was a manga made for it because I feel like that this show had potential at actually being really great. Like, sure, it's just another Ikasai show, which, yeah, like I've said before, they're a dime a dozen nowadays, but back then, they weren't so much. And not only that, but there's a lot of really cool ideas that they had here, which I already talked about, like the whole historical figures fighting each other in the other world. And the characters themselves, they were okay. I think they had potential at, like, growing and becoming better characters. Because I do think that Mickey was actually a pretty decent protagonist for what she was. Like, for one, she wasn't one of those spoiled goody two-shoes type characters who's always doing, like, the dumbest shit. Because she did try to make attempts on trying to do things on her own, but of course, Hijikata had to do all the heavy lifting. And I do think that Mickey could have used some more action scenes involved, and I think that would have made things a lot better. But yeah, overall, it's an average show that is inoffensive, and I didn't think it was boring personally. I thought it was at least decently fun enough for what it was, but I do think it would have been nice if we had, like, maybe 3 more episodes or something. Like, not a crazy amount of episodes, but I think if we had at least 3 more, the show could have been even more than just decent. I think it could have at least been a good, solid show. So if you had to spend 1 hour watching an anime, yeah, I don't think it was bad. It definitely isn't the most highly recommended thing I can say. I mean, I do think the last one I talked about, I would recommend to way more people, but, you know, if you want something that's just purely mindless fun with some, nice animation, with some good aesthetics, and on top of that, having some pretty cool ideas, like having some samurais going up against some cyborgs, and with some, like, historical figures. So yeah, it's a pretty neat idea. That could have been so much more, but for what we got, it was okay. And I'm glad that at least it wasn't boring, bad, and didn't end on a cliffhanger.